Okay, so I think we are good to go. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Reading Critically, a workshop brought to you by the University Writing Center. My name is Monique Bain, and I am the coordinator of the center and will be facilitating this workshop today. So once again, thank you for joining. So why a workshop on reading critically? Well, as a university student, you will be asked in any number of courses within any discipline really to respond critically to a text. And a text can really take many different forms, which is what this slide shows. So a text may be a piece of poetry in an English class, or it might be a painting in an art class, or it might be music that you're responding to, the lyrics of a song. Even in an English class, you might be asked to write a critical analysis of a song. It may also be, but most commonly, it is an academic article that you're being asked to respond to. So anything that has been created for human consumption in some way can be evaluated and it can be critiqued. And learning those skills is a part of the college or university experience. However, for the purpose of this workshop, I will be focusing on the written text, whether academic or literary, and looking at strategies that can be used to interpret and evaluate them. Now, if you happen to be working on some other kind of text, a critical analysis or critique of a film, or like I said before, a song or something like that, if time allows, I can elaborate on that at the end of the workshop as well. And you'll have some time to ask some questions, hopefully, if I could get through this within the hour. Okay, so first of all, as we look at the skill of reading critically, I thought it was important to discuss why this skill is important. And I came up with 4 main reasons. First of all, critical readers can think independently. That means that you can examine a text and not just take it at face value. You compare that information that's found in the text to your own point of view, to other texts that you may have read on the topic, and you're able to come to a conclusion. In other words, you're able to respond to what you've read and not just accept information that's thrown at you. Related to this, critical readers can also make informed decisions. And this is important, especially when you have to act on something. So understanding an issue before you act on it is important in many instances in our daily lives, from anything from voting to deciding whether or not to get vaccinated. Now, I'm not going to get into that vaccination debate, but there's lots of information floating around in support of it, against it, and you have to use your critical and evaluative skills to sort of determine what information is accurate and what's valid. So it has this critical reading skill. It has everyday value or use. Okay. Thirdly, that means that if you're a critical reader, you're not easily manipulated, because that means you're not going to be influenced by techniques that some writers may use to get you to support their point of view, like emotional appeals that may be over the top, or their own personal biases. And we see this kind of writing a lot, on social media platforms, when people say things like, this particular immigrant group is taking over and they're taking all our jobs and things like that. Those techniques are used to evoke an emotional response and, get people angry and fearful. And so a critical reader is aware of when they are being manipulated by information. And finally, and maybe most importantly to your college or university experience, critical readers are better writers, okay? And so we learn to write by reading good writing. And if we're able to evaluate good writing, then we can sort of follow the same kinds of processes. And it also helps you in terms of finding sources when you're working on research papers and ensuring that you're finding sources that are suitable or provide accurate information to support your ideas. So all of these skills are really the hallmark of a university graduate. I mean, that's why, people talk about having an educated population. When you have an educated population, then that population can assess information that's given to them and respond appropriately. So that brings me to the objectives of the session and what I hope to accomplish by the end of it. First, I'm going to define what critical reading is, and then we're going to look at some specific strategies that we can use when we're reading critically. I'm going to plug in my headphones because I live in a high traffic area and you're probably hearing all these trucks and stuff passing, and I'm hoping that the headphones will minimize that a bit. Okay. So after we talk about what critical reading is and review some of the strategies, then we will look at ways to respond critically in your writing. So specifically how to approach a critical analysis essay or a critique of something that you may have been asked to do in one of your courses. And then finally, we'll have at the end of it, I'll allow for questions. I'm willing to stay on as long as needed to answer questions. It could be general questions about the process. It can be specific questions about something that you're working on in terms of getting an idea or sort of determining whether you're heading in the right direction. Okay. I think I'll turn the recording off when we get into the questions component, depending on how people feel about, maintaining their privacy. Okay, so first, what does it mean to read critically? Now I have a definition up here that says critical reading is an active approach to reading in which a reader searches a text for meaning and evaluates a text by examining the writer's purpose, use of evidence, language, and structure. So in other words, a critical reader doesn't just take information at face value. Now, there are several key words in this definition that I really want to draw your attention to. The first word is meaning, okay? If you're reading critically, that means you must understand the text. Now, that seems pretty obvious, but I cannot tell you the number of times that I have assisted students who are working on critical writing assignments who have not, read the text fully, or they kind of read it, but they didn't understand anything about it. And so if you don't grasp the meaning, then you won't be able to analyze the text. So understanding the text really is the starting point. So skimming is never going to be good enough. Waiting the day before an assignment is due to work on a critical reading assignment is not a good idea because it takes time, to process the reading, especially academic articles that tend to be long and full of language that might be more sophisticated than we're accustomed to, right? And so it is an active approach. That means that, you can't sort of peruse an article while you're scrolling on social media on your phone and all this sort of stuff, okay? So it requires your attention. Secondly, an important word in this definition is this idea of to evaluate. So when you evaluate a text, you're basically making a judgment about it. In other words, you as the reader, you determine whether the text is valuable in some way, if it's saying something meaningful, and you have to determine that value. But before you can determine that value, you must be aware of what the writer's purpose is. Someone's mic is unmuted. Thanks. And so when we look at purpose, it means why was the piece written? What is the writer's motivation, so to speak? And purpose may fall into several different categories. These are, I would say, four of the main ones, but there are lots more. A writer may produce something for entertainment purposes only. This is usually more common, like say with a piece of poetry or art or something like that, or just sharing their observations. But at the university setting, in most cases, the kind of writing that you will look at, the author's purpose may be to persuade or convince readers of a particular point of view or change their opinion about a topic, to give information about a topic that may be unfamiliar or that needs further examination, or to analyze the topic, meaning, break it down into smaller bits, manageable bits, particularly if an issue is complex, okay, to help readers understand. So your starting point is always to determine what is the writer's purpose. Why? In other words, why? Why did they write this document? Why did they produce this text? So now we're going to talk about some of the steps that we can take when we're faced with a piece of particularly academic writing, those super long articles, like 20 something pages long, with a million sections. So how do you approach that? The first step is to survey the material you are asked to read before you start reading, okay? So you want to get a sense of what you're getting into, so to speak, first. And so we start by reading the title. Now, the title can tell you a lot. It'll reveal maybe the position or the perspective of the writer. A lot of papers that are written, for instance, in APA style, tell you outright this paper is about whatever based on the title, right? Then you can look at the abstract, which provides a summary of the writer's ideas. And a lot of times these abstracts provide information about the context, the background information, what the writer's intention was, and what their findings and conclusions are, and even their purpose may be included in the abstract. So that's really a good starting point to get a sense of what the article is about if one is provided. Then you look at the headings and subheadings, because they are tools of organization that writers use, and they most likely will reveal main ideas that support the overall purpose, right? Particularly if you're looking at an article that maybe doesn't have headings, then you want to look at the first sentence of each paragraph, because typically writers that are informing or persuading readers of a particular view will state their main idea first, and the remainder of the paragraph elaborates on that idea and provides examples and evidence and research to support it. So that's a good starting point as well, just looking at the first sentences of each paragraph just to get a sense of where this paper is going. Another tip that I give students when you're reading, particularly those longer academic articles, would be to read the introduction and the conclusion, because that can really give you a clear sense of the article. Introductions tend to establish why the topic is important. It provides background information, and the conclusion usually summarizes the findings or the results. And all of these ideas are central to having a sense of purpose and having a sense of meaning. Now, I know that talking about these ideas in a vacuum is, just talking about them sort of philosophically doesn't necessarily make it easier to understand. So in this, in the following slide, I have a screenshot here of a scholarly article, the first page. So let's say you were assigned this particular article to read, and you're using this sort of survey thing. What you'll discover is we could get a good sense of what this article is about before we even start reading. So the first thing I said we look at is misogyny in rap music. As a reader, if I look at that title, I might say to myself, okay, So this is about rap music. It's about misogyny. Maybe I don't know what the word misogyny means. So a first step would be to look it up, right? And then I may discover, okay, this is a type of music that is disrespectful to women in some way. And then we look at the subheading, or the subtitle, I should say. It says it's a content analysis of prevalence and meanings. So it's looking at rap music. It's analyzing something. Remember earlier in the earlier slide, I said that a purpose could be analysis. So right off the top, I know that this article is going to analyze rap music in some way, probably for the misogynistic lyrics, right? Now, right below, we see the abstract, which summarizes the content of the article, and there's some keywords: rap music, sexuality, gender, mass media, hegemonic masculinity. That might be another term that I want to look up. Oh, what's hegemonic masculinity, and what does this have to do with rap music? And then when I look that up, then I realized that that's the idea that men should be have all these sort of macho traits and be assertive and aggressive, and it's sort of tied to toxic masculinity and all this sort of stuff. And we know about being toxic because people are always posting about toxic stuff on social media. And so that gives me a sense again of what I'm getting into. So looking at, I'm going to go ahead and read the abstract. Rap music has a reputation for being misogynistic, but surprisingly, little research has systematically investigated this dimension of the music. This study assesses the portrayal of women in a representative sample of 403 rap songs. Content analysis identified 5 gender-related themes in this body of music, themes that contain messages regarding essential male and female characteristics, and that espouse a set of conduct norms for men and women. Our analysis situates rap music within the context of larger cultural and music industry norms and the local neighborhood conditions that inspired this music in the first place. So that's a mouthful, right? But we get an idea of what they're trying to do. So we know that they want to conduct some research to determine whether rap music really is misogynistic. They're making the claim that the idea is out there that rap music is misogynistic, but there's not a lot of research to support it. We also notice in this abstract that they're going to be looking at 5 specific themes relating to the music and its misogyny, but those themes are not identified. So as we skim the article further, we may see those themes, and then that again will increase our understanding of what we are about to read. So all of this is taking place before we actually read the article. So remember I said that another step, especially with these longer articles, would be to review the introduction and review the conclusion. So what I've taken here is a snapshot of the final paragraph in that particular paper's introduction, okay? And I'm gonna read it. Much of the criticism of rap music is impressionistic and based on a handful of anecdotes rather than systematic analysis. Exactly how prevalent are misogynistic themes in this music, and what specific messages are conveyed to listeners? This study addresses this question through a content analysis of more than 400 rap songs. We document 5 themes related to the portrayal of women in rap music and link them to a larger cultural and music industry norms, to larger cultural and music industry norms and the local neighborhood conditions that inspired this music. So as you've learned in many of your writing classes, at the end of the introduction is where writers tend to put their thesis statement or identify what the paper intends to cover. And so when we just jump to the final paragraph of the introduction in this paper, we see the writers doing just that. They pose some questions that they want to answer, and they explain exactly how the study goes about analyzing this music. Again, we see reference to 5 themes that are not identified. So we know that those 5 themes will play an important role in the development of the paper before we even start to read it. And so another technique would be to look, like I said, at major headings. Um, and that may include looking at tables that are presented. And so as I skim this particular article, table 1 captures the misogynistic theme. So now we have even more information because we know what themes they were looking at as they analyzed, what was it, the 400 songs that they said they were going to look at. And so we see these themes listed here. The themes are naming and shaming, sexual objectification, distrust of women, legitimating violence, prostitution, and pimping. So I'm assuming they're looking for references to this sort of misogynistic take on women in the rap music. And we have the statistics in terms of frequency in songs. We can look at it and see that just from perusing that the most common misogynistic practice in the rap music that they examined at 67% was sexual objectification of women. And so again, we haven't read the article yet, but our understanding of the article is growing before we actually sort of fill in the gaps. And so just using this as an example again, I find another heading, and it's naming and shaming. And so this is one of the 5 points that we just saw in the table, right? And so remember I said, read the first sentence of each major paragraph, and that'll give you an idea of what that section is about. So let's see if that holds true in this particular case. What is naming and shaming? So it says a number of rap songs can be described as full-fledged status degradation ceremony, as a full-fledged status degradation ceremony directed at women, a ritual destruction of the person denounced. And they're quoting another source to sort of bring this idea forward. So in these songs, it is typically women in general, rather than a specific person, who are shamed with derogatory names. This theme was present in 49% of the misogynistic songs. So now by reading that first paragraph, we understand that the naming and shaming that they're looking at is this idea that women are called derogatory names in rap music. Now, the paragraph that follows provides some analysis of that. We see some of the terms that they're looking at, and we see that there's some discussion that they acknowledge that they realize that sometimes when these derogatory terms are used, they're not necessarily used in a negative way, although some people will always perceive those terms as negative and so on and so forth. But the point is, we now understand one of the key terms, or one of the attributes that they're looking for in the music, which is naming and shaming, and we understand what they mean by that. And so if we go through the article and we look at the other 5 headings that look at objectification of women, or whatever the other ones were, I can't remember, then we get a sense of it again. But the point of what the point that I'm making is, just by looking at headings and key sentences, we're already getting a sense of the article's content, and the writer's purpose. And we already have a sense of the ways in which that purpose is established as well, because we see the author is quoting other people who have recognized that rap music can be derogatory towards women. We see them providing specific examples of some of the terms that they consider derogatory and things like that. So we're already getting a good sense of the article, and that's what skimming the article before you read it helps you to do. So after you have skimmed the article, looked at the headings, look at the conclusion, and get a sense of what it's about, now you're ready to read the article in its entirety. Now you have to read the whole thing, because I'll never tell you just read the introduction, conclusion, and then write a paper. That's not going to work. You have to read the paper. And I know that as a college student, you don't have time for this. Like, you don't have time to read this one article 6 times for your English professor. Like, who has time for that? But the fact of the matter is that if you are going to respond to an article critically, in most cases, the meaning of what the writer's trying to say cannot be fully grasped in just a single reading, and you will have to interact with the article several times. But I always think it's a good idea to just read it. And when I say read without judgment, I mean just read it. Like, you don't have to have your pen in hand and start underlining things, because I think that could be a bit distracting. You just want to read it to get a sense of what it's about after you've skimmed it. And then you'll go back in and look at it more closely and make your annotations and make note of key points that you want to summarize, or gather evidence that you want to use to support your views. Or if you're reading an article critically for your own research paper, then you could start putting a star, an asterisk, or whatever beside the portions of the text that are helpful to you. Okay. But when you skim the material first, that means that you don't just sort of have a cold reading of it where you just sort of jump in and you don't know what it's about. And this is particularly useful if it's subject matter that you don't really have any exposure to. Okay, so following this process is really helpful for a topic that you either don't know much about or that may be sort of complex. All right, so that brings us to the third step. Read the text again more closely, making annotations or detailed notes as you read. So as you prepare to annotate, you want to look for specific things. First of all, you want to identify the writer's thesis statement. And basically, that is the sentence that captures the topic the writer is addressing and the writer's position on that topic. Now, keep in mind that a thesis statement may be one sentence, it may be 2 or 3. It may be stated explicitly. And in most academic pieces, they do tend to state what they intend to argue, usually at the end of the introduction. In this paper, I argue that women are treated unfairly and that blah, 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 right? So you can look for that. The thesis statement usually makes a claim, or it's answering questions. So where the purpose of the paper tells us why the person is writing, the thesis tells us what they have to say about the topic. So I may write a paper, for instance, and my purpose may be to persuade the government to not legalize the use of marijuana. That's my purpose. Why am I writing? I don't want marijuana legalized. But my thesis will identify specifically my topic, which is the legalization of marijuana, and my position that I don't want it legalized and why I don't want it legalized. So the thesis might say something like, marijuana shouldn't be legalized because it leads to, it's a gateway drug. I don't know if any of this is true. I'm just making stuff, right? The gateway drug, it leads to psychological issues, and it, I don't know, it's responsible for some acts of violence. I don't know if any of that is true, about marijuana. I'm not saying anything about marijuana. It's just a silly example I came up with off the top of my head. So yeah, so we want to look for the thesis statement. So in this particular article, I think the study addresses the question through a content analysis of more than 400 rap songs. We document 5 themes related to the portrayal of women in rap music and link them to the larger cultural and music industry norms and local neighborhood conditions that inspired this music. And so I think that sort of captures what the paper is about. They're examining rap music for 5 specific themes of misogyny, and they also want to connect those themes to the music industry in some way and to the culture. And so we can assume they discuss how these themes reflect the culture and perhaps how the music industry benefits from these themes being constantly promoted, particularly in the Black community. All right. So we want to, once we have highlighted the thesis, then we can identify the main points that support that thesis. Okay, so we're looking again for those topic sentences, just like the one I identified in the previous slide that looked at what naming and shaming is, right? As you read, you want to look at how paragraphs connect to each other. Sometimes a paragraph is extending a point and not necessarily introducing a new point. Maybe it's providing an extended example or elaborating on something. Maybe it's providing a contrasting point. So these are the sorts of things that you want to look at as you read. And of course, you always want to look up the words you don't know. I know I'm guilty of it. Sometimes you read an article and you hit a word, don't know the meaning of the word, you just keep it moving because you're like, oh, you know, I understand everything else. No, if you're reading critically, take the time to look up that word because that word may really impact your understanding of a point in some way that you're not aware of. And, you know, look up references that writers make to other terms, or like how, like in the, like at the beginning of this piece when we looked at the keywords and we looked up toxic masculinity and all of that, you know, you can do like independent research on, particularly if it's a topic that you're not familiar with, to make sure that you're really getting the writer's point, because it's important to understand what they're saying before you can evaluate whether they're doing a good job saying it or not, right? So you can't evaluate something that you do not understand. So that's very important. So once you have a firm understanding of what the author's purpose is and what the thesis is and what the main ideas are, now you can identify the strategies that the writer uses to support or develop his ideas. And by the way, that skimming of the article can really help you when you're writing the summary of the article, because usually when you are responding critically to a piece, it's a good idea to summarize it briefly first, because a critical analysis essay should always be written in a way that someone who has not read the text should be able to follow the development of your ideas, right? All right, so we want to look for specific strategies that the writer uses to support or develop his ideas. And in this table, I kind of list some of the things that we can look for. So we want to look for evidence, okay? How does the writer substantiate his or her claim? So there are different ways they can do this. They may provide facts. They may use statistical information. They may use expert opinion. So, you know, they may have a lot of references to other studies and things like that. Depending on the kind of source, whether it's an academic one or a literary one, they may use anecdotes, which are stories that sort of, you know, show something to be true. They may reflect on their own personal experience. So these are all different kinds of evidence that a writer may use. And even in the, you know, the brief paragraph we looked at, we saw that these particular writers of the article made references to other people who studied rap music. They definitely will be using a lot of statistical information because it is an analysis. And so they're looking at percentages, and the percentages reflect how frequent a particular misogynistic attribute is evident in a song, and so on and so forth, right? So those are things that you could take notice of. And whenever you see them, just make a note of it. So you say, oh, in this paragraph, the writer uses statistics to do this, but then in the paragraph at the end of the document, the writer uses statistics to do that. And so all of that would be included in a single paragraph in which you look at the skillful use of statistics to help some aspect of the writer's argument. Okay. Also, you can look at the style. Now, style has a lot to do with language, looking at whether it's written in a formal or informal way. And usually we look at word choice and things like that to determine that. You want to consider the point of view. Is it written in the first person, which is, I or we? Is it written in the third person, where they make reference to rap music or rap artists or Bahamians or students, right? And that usually suggests that something is more formal and the writer wants to maintain a certain distance from the audience. Or maybe they may use the second person. This is very rare and you don't see it in academic writing, which is the you should do this, you should do that. And each approach has a different effect on the reader and it informs the style. So obviously a piece that's written with a lot of personal pronouns or speaks directly to the reader with the use of you is more informal, right? Or if it, intersperses slang and things like that, that's more informal. But if the writer, sticks with third person and uses sophisticated language and long sentences and things like that, then it's a more formal style document. Now I have an asterisk by the other two elements you could look out for, like figurative language and tone. These elements are not generally what you would look for in an academic piece. This is more for literary pieces in the humanities, a creative piece, you might look at things like figurative language. So the use of metaphors and allusions and similes and hyperbole, personification and all this sort of thing, right? Or you might look at the tone of the writer, which is the feeling that a text conveys. So again, that really only applies to literary texts, maybe poetry or even songs or music if you're analyzing something like that. Something else that you could look at when you're analyzing text would be methods of paragraph development or how the writer has organized his or her. And what I've provided there are sort of like a list of the different methods writers can use to develop ideas. So sometimes they may tell a story that'll connect to the whole anecdote as evidence thing. They may use description, provide vivid imagery of something. Again, that may lend itself more to literary type texts and details. But in terms of academic work or academic pieces, I think the remaining strategies are more common. So using examples, right? Those examples may be real, they may be hypothetical. Defining key terms, that is a method of development or a strategy. And we saw a bit of that in the article that we just looked at as they define what is naming and shaming. And they probably define what is sexual objectification and things like that further on in the article. Comparison, comparing and contrasting is something, is another strategy as well. I didn't share it here in this presentation, but when I looked at that article, they also compared the misogyny in rap music to country music and rock music. And usually when writers make those sorts of comparisons, they're trying to demonstrate something as well. And in that case, they were looking at this idea that it was definitely more prevalent in rap music than it was in those other forms. And in rap music, it tended to be more explicitly stated, whereas in some rock music, it's more implied and things like that. So comparison and contrast is another technique that you might want to reflect on. the writer using as you critique the work, and how successfully they do that, and how it helps them to make their point, right? Or support their argument. Cause and effect, looking at the reasons and the impact of something. Maybe that shows up in this article when they look at the cultural influence of this music, whether the music is influenced by the culture or whether the music influences the culture. And that ties to the whole discussion of what they deem the toxic masculinity, where they mentioned this expectation that males are expected to be hypersexualized and have numerous partners and all of that, and that's sort of promoted in the music and in the culture out of which the music arises, right? And so analysis means just breaking down something into smaller parts. So as you look at a larger piece, for each paragraph, what I encourage students to do as you read each paragraph, note what the main idea is, note what kind of evidence is used, note what strategies are used to develop it, right? If you write those notes on the side of your paper, well, I guess everything is electronic now, so I don't know how guys go about making your notes. Maybe you could write on paper, I don't know. But as you do that, you may start to see certain trends. You say, oh, wow, this writer used an example in the first paragraph, and they also used it in the 8th paragraph. So this is a technique that they use quite frequently, and it's showing one issue in the first and another in the second. Or you might say, oh, wow, they use comparison quite a bit, because in the beginning they compare this to that, and then 2 paragraphs later they compare this to that. So you want to sort of note where you see similarities in development, because those ideas would be grouped together when you respond to the piece critically, which we'll look at a little bit later. Okay, so I'm talking a lot. I want to just pause and see how we are understanding anything we just said. Now, this is a brief paragraph. We're not going to get all into it, but maybe we could just test what you've learned so far, if you're learning anything, right? So I'll read the paragraph. You have it up on the screen. You can read it as well. And at the end of the paragraph, it asks you to identify what you think the author's main purpose is. And then I'll see if you all come to the same conclusion. But as you do that, you can also look at what strategies do you see at play in this one paragraph. Like, what are some of the methods of development that you see at work that you would be able to identify if you were making notes on this paragraph? So I will read it first. It says, Japan has long had a large population for its land area, especially since the baby boom following World War II. This is particularly true in Japan's cities. For example, according to a 2010 census, the metropolitan Tokyo-Yokohama area has an estimated 35 million residents. The population of the country is roughly 128 million. Tokyo-Yokohama is considered the most populous urban center in the world. Some Japanese cultural traditions have been attributed to such crowding. For example, the Japanese people often use very formal behaviors like bowing and use very formal language during social interactions. One theory is that this formality, at least in part, is a means of creating psychological distance and space between individuals, as sufficient physical space is lacking. The expression too close for comfort may aptly describe the situation in Japan's most crowded cities, and this physical proximity is offset by reducing social closeness. So this question says, in this passage, the author's main purpose is to, and remember, why are they writing this? What do they want us to know? What is the main point that they want us to get out of all of this, right? Is it A, to give a complete summary of the demographic features of Japan? B, describe a hypothesis of social behavior based on demographics? C, explain why the population of Japan has increased since the war? D, give a very detailed description of acceptable Japanese manners? Or E, argue that Japan has the highest population density in the world? We have any takers? Which one do you think it is? What's the purpose?
I think it's E.
Did you say E as an egg?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone
Because,
else? Oh, well, yeah, go ahead and explain why.
because of the topic sentence, it sounds like it's talking about overpopulation.
Mhm.
So that I think is the giveaway. And they are just talking about their social behaviors are responsible for the overpopulation. So that's why I chose E.
Okay. Argue that Japan has the highest population density in the world. Okay, I'm seeing some other answers. I'm seeing, thank you for your explanation. I'm seeing B, which is describe a hypothesis of social behavior based on demographics. Anyone who answered B wants to say why they think it's B? Maybe in the chat.
I
No?
choose E
Oh.
because when you look at the paragraph as a whole, it's like it's saying, it describes the social population distance, but also that how it affects the behavior. And when you look at the last sentence, like as the thesis of the introduction, you see how it talks about the social closeness that they have with one another.
Okay, thank you. Good. So my answer is B, right? And I say it's B because the information that comes at the beginning of the sentence, it's just establishing context. It's showing that Japan is a really crowded place. It's been crowded for a while, and there are lots of people living there. And so in all cases, the first sentence of a paragraph may not necessarily capture the paragraph's main idea. Now that topic sentence may be placed elsewhere, and I think it's placed elsewhere in this paragraph. Can anyone identify what they believe to be the topic sentence of this paragraph? Oh, let me look in the chat. I keep getting to it. Oh, that's someone saying why they chose B. Okay, thank you, Justin. Right. So I think the person who spoke last said, and I'm sorry I didn't make a note of your name. The expression "too close for comfort" may aptly describe the situation in Japan's most crowded cities, and this physical proximity is offset by reducing social closeness. I think that sentence wraps up the writer's purpose, and it actually appears at the end. I think a case can actually be made also for some Japanese cultural traditions have been attributed to such crowding because everything that follows after that information about how many people live there is sort of explaining why Japanese people are so formal in their interaction because they're so, jammed up, so to speak, to put it in Bahamian vernacular, so jammed up everywhere else. They try to maintain this distance by being formal and bowing and doing all of these things. So it takes some practice, but that's why we can't give hard and fast rules about, well, the topic sentence is going to be here or the thesis is going to be here. You really have to look at the passage as a whole or the paragraph in this case as a whole. And so we see a lot of strategies at play. For instance, if you were evaluating this, you could talk about the fact that statistical information was used. You have the 35 million residents and information from the 2010 census. And what is that used for? See, because part of the analysis is not just identifying the strategy, but talking about the effect of the strategy or how it helps to promote the writer's idea. And so in that sense, that statistical information is used to establish that overcrowding is a problem in Japan, okay? And so by referring to the census, then we can trust that this information is credible, okay? So it also builds the credibility of the writer as well, okay? The tone of the piece is serious. Third person is mostly used. We can look at the diction to say that the style is formal because it uses words like populous urban center instead of, you know, crowded city or something like that, metropolitan, you know, so psychological distance and all this sort of terminology suggests that this is a more formal piece, even though there is the insertion of the proverb too close for comfort, or the expression too close for comfort, right? We see cause and effect at play in this paragraph as well. They're saying the crowding is leading to the cultural traditions, right? So, you know, this is just a short paragraph and we could already, you know, pull out several things. And so that's why analysis is time consuming and requires some practice. Okay, so what time is it? It's 2:52. I hope that you all will give me till 3:15, and I promise I will be done with it. So the second part of this workshop, we're going to look at responding critically in your writing. And so this part should be useful if you're working on a critical analysis essay or a critique of a piece. How do you go about responding to the piece now that you understand it and you've written all of your notes and you identified the strategies and things that were used? You're ready to now determine how to structure your response. Give me 1 minute. Right back. There's some noise coming in. Okay, so in this section, we'll talk more about writing a paper that responds critically to a text, and we're going to examine what the expectations of a critique or critical analysis essay are. All right, so when asked to respond critically to a piece, you need to be sure that you do not simply summarize the piece. And I wanted to start with this analogy of someone being asked about a party to sort of demonstrate that there is a distinct difference between summary and analysis. And I think one of the mistakes that students sometimes make when they're writing an analysis essay is that too much time is just spent summarizing information, even in the body paragraphs, okay? So in this analogy, if I ask someone a question, what happened at a party? What happened? That's like the summary. What is it about? Well, I might say, okay, first we walked the red carpet, then we had some cocktails, then we sat down, we had a 5-course meal, there was a live band, and then when we left, we were given gifts. That's the summary. That's objective. It just tells me what happened. My opinion is not a part of that. I'm just stating the facts, so to speak, and that's what a summary does. Now, if someone asks me, how was the party? Then I have to engage analysis, right? And so when you're responding to a piece, your professor is in essence asking you, how was this piece? Was it effective? Was it convincing? Was it well written, right? So if you ask someone, well, how was the party? Then you're gonna make a judgment. You're gonna say it was good or it was bad, right? So if I say it was enjoyable, that's a judgment. I thought it was enjoyable. Someone else may have a different view, right? But if I say it's enjoyable, then I must have evidence to support that. And that's what you're trying to do in a critical analysis piece. So I might say, my opinion might be, it was enjoyable because it was elegant. Now, how do I support that? Where do I see the elegance? Because we walked the red carpet and we had a 5-course meal. That's elegant, all right? I enjoyed it because we were treated well. What's my evidence? Well, we had cocktails and we got free gifts. And my other evaluation may be, oh, it was not boring at all. It was great. What's my support for that? Well, we had a live band. Doesn't get more exciting than that, right? So if I were to put this in the form of thesis, I'll say, well, the party was enjoyable because the event was elegant, the guests were well treated, and there was never a dull moment. That's my thesis. And then each one of those points represents the topic sentence, and I'm going to have to explain how I came to that conclusion. So basically, that's what you're attempting to do in a critical analysis essay. So let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Typically speaking, we begin with a summary or description of the original text. And when we do that, in that opening sentence that introduces it, we want to identify the author, the title, and the thesis in the first sentence of your summary. Now, let me just say, the first sentence of your summary may not necessarily be the first sentence of your introduction. Your summary is a part of your introduction. You may begin your essay in a completely different way by maybe just reflecting on the topic at first before introducing the piece that you will be analyzing, okay? So, but there has to be a point in that introduction where it's clear who or what you're talking about and what it is that they did. So as an example here, in a totally made up, in the article, cats make great pets. John Doe argues that cats make great, well, I shouldn't have said cat makes great pets. You don't want to use the words that's in the title, so that's a terrible example, scratch that. But John Doe argues that cats are underrated as pets and have been unfairly maligned, okay? That's the gist of what it's about. Then I can provide another 3 or 4 sentences that capture the main ideas. But once I identify that the name of the author is John Doe, then I don't have to keep saying John Doe, John Doe, John Doe. I can just say, Doe begins his piece by reflecting on the popularity of dogs as pets in comparison to cats. He then goes on to blah, 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 blah. Furthermore, he yada, yada, yada. So we want to aim to summarize main ideas, and we don't want to spend too much time on examples and details. We want to maintain an objective tone. Your opinion should not be in the piece, whether it was good or bad at that point, not when you're summarizing it. And you can, of course, use transitional words and phrases to connect ideas as needed. So after you have sort of written your introduction and summarized the piece, you need to make sure that you've carefully planned your introduction. These are some questions that you can ask yourself about the text. Who's the audience? How do you know that? What's the writer's purpose? Is there a clear thesis? What kind of wording or language is used in the text? Is it formal? Is it informal? How is the text organized? What additional information is provided aside from the text? Are there appendices, autobiography? What kind of evidence? And we touched on all of this already in terms of reading critically. We have historical information, facts, studies, examples, personal experience. What are some of the themes raised, okay? How do these themes connect to other articles that we've read on the same issue? What strategies of development are used? We talked about those already. And like I said, for humanities, it may be a little different. You might want to focus on figures of speech and things like that, tone and all of that. But for the sciences, you might want to look at, well, what research method was used? Was it empirical, relying on numbers and surveys and things like that, or was it qualitative? Was it a case study? Okay, so these are the sorts of things that you want to think about as you plan and organize accordingly. At the end of your summary, you must write a thesis statement, and that thesis statement should be evaluative. So what do I mean by that? That thesis should make a judgment, and it should also identify the reasons that justify your judgment, so to speak. And so I have a few examples listed here. The writer successfully defends her position that whatever the position is, you have to say specifically what it is, right? kind of effectively conveys his ideas about sometimes the writer may be successful in some ways, but not in others. So then you might begin, while the writer convincingly demonstrates that this and that happens through the use of this and that, he fails to do something. And you could say why he fails. It might be the presence of fallacies or personal bias or limited research or something like that. So sometimes it is necessary to point out where an article did not work so well. But most of the articles that your professors have you read, they probably think are working pretty well, and you really need to point out the strengths of it. Overall, and this is for an article that just fails, which I said, I don't think your professor would necessarily give you an article like this to cover. Overall, the writer is unsuccessful in his attempt to convince readers because the evidence is weak, the examples are limited, and whatever. But like I said, it's very rare to see that sort of critique where everything is just wrong, because most of the times your professors are giving you articles that they think are strong ones and that are working for the most part. Again, justify or identify the reasons that justify your position. Colley effectively uses statistical evidence, relevant examples, and historical data to convince readers that whatever he's convincing them of. And so we know that the 3 points in this particular critique is going to focus on how the writer uses statistics, how the writer uses examples, and how the writer uses history to really persuade readers of their point of view. Now, this is sort of like what I call a paragraph template. You don't have to follow this exactly, but it just gives you an idea of how you can approach the development of your body paragraph. So you begin with a clear topic sentence that identifies one particular strategy that you intend to look at. Then you can explain that strategy a bit, then refer to an example from the text to support evidence of that strategy. You can elaborate on the example, explain it or interpret its meaning, and then critically assess the impact of that strategy, either on the writer's argument, the effect it has on you as a reader, or the overall subject matter. So you may be commenting on how it helps to make the writer's argument stronger, or you may be commenting on how it evokes a certain response in the reader that convinces them of something, or you might reflect on, I lost my train of thought, so I don't know what the third thing I was gonna say. Okay, but you get the idea. Like, you have to critically assess the strategy and say why it works, right? And then you may want to provide a second example of that same strategy and do the same thing to have a fully developed and convincing body paragraph. So analysis must be clearly explained. I just, want to compare like a weak paragraph to one that might be stronger. And this, of course, is pulling from the literary or humanities. Let's say that you say that one strength of this passage is the writer's use of metaphors. And then the person writes to, in paragraph 2, she writes, blah, blah, blah. He was angry because the police, da, da, da. See, now, the writer didn't really, in this example, prepare the reader for the discussion. The topic sentence is there, identifying that metaphor is a strength, and then the writer just jumps to the example and goes on to say, well, he was angry, this is a problem, men from urban areas are at risk, and statistics show they're more likely to become victims of police brutality. Now a whole new idea was introduced, statistics, and that's not what this paragraph is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about the use of metaphors. So a better way to do this is shown below, where the writer prepares the reader a bit more for the discussion. So one strength of the passage is Whitmore's use of metaphors. to effectively capture the negative feelings that police brutality creates. So don't just say the person uses something. You have to say they use this to accomplish something. You have to identify what is accomplished. And then you can provide the example. For example, in the second paragraph, she states this. The person then explains why the metaphor is successful because it's comparing the man's state to that of an erupting volcano. And like the volcano, the results can be devastating to everyone in their path. So there's a bit of an elaboration, right? And then the concluding sentence says, using such imagery helps readers gain an appreciation for the frustration that many young men feel, which she argues is a major reason for escalating violence in our communities and death at the hands of police officers. So some critical insight is also provided as to why this particular strategy works and how it helps the argument overall. So you want to make sure that your critical analysis essay provides that. And finally, when concluding the essay, there are numerous techniques that you can use to restate your evaluation in a way that's different from your thesis. Reflect on the significance of the text overall, or the value of the topic generally, maybe connected to the Bahamian context if your class allows for that. You can make recommendations about who would find this text useful and why, who should read this, who this would be of value to, because remember, you're offering a critique, okay? So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I hope that it was useful in helping you to organize your essays, whether you're working on critical analyses or any other type of critiques. And I will stop recording